If you grew up in Ontario in the 70s or 80s, your lunchbox almost certainly held something from McCormick's. A marshmallow banana with its faint crust of sugar, a strip of licorice babies, a Jersey cream soda biscuit your mother had packed that morning. Behind that wrapper stood a white terracotta building on Dundas Street in London, Ontario, that locals called the Sunshine Palace. At its peak, the factory employed 1,300 people and produced 135,000 pounds of candy a day. They survived the Great Depression, survived 2 world wars, survived the recessions of the 1970s and 80s, 3 changes of corporate ownership. And then, after nearly 150 years of making candy in London, the gates closed 3 days into 2007. How does a name that was in every kitchen in Ontario simply go silent? What happened? Chapter 1. The Irish Grocer. The story begins in Dungannon, in what was then County Tyrone, Ireland. A boy named Thomas McCormick was born there on the 1st of July, 1830. He was 19 when he left, part of the great Irish emigration that followed the famine years, when whole counties seemed to empty toward the western Atlantic. He didn't sail directly to Canada. He stopped first in Buffalo, New York, that bustling lake port at the western end of the Erie Canal. And it was there he met Catherine Armstrong, the woman he would marry. By the early 1850s, the couple had moved north, across the river that divided 2 countries, and settled in the small Ontario town of London, named for the British capital, built on a fork in a river also called the Thames. He didn't arrive with a fortune. He didn't arrive with a trade. He worked as a clerk in a grocery shop for several years, measuring out flour and sugar and tea, learning what people bought and how often, watching the small economy of a 19th century British colonial town from behind a wooden counter. It was the kind of patient apprenticeship that taught a young man with no capital exactly what kind of business he might one day build. In 1858, he made his move. On Clarence Street, in rented premises, he began to manufacture candy. He named the firm the Dominion Steam Confectionery and Biscuit Works, a name with weight, a name suggesting machinery and ambition. He was 28 years old. He had a wife and the beginnings of a family. And he was setting up shop in direct competition with another London confectioner, Daniel Simmons Perrin, whose own Forest City Steam Confectionery and Biscuit Works had been operating for 4 years already. McCormick chose his name to echo Perrin's. The challenge was deliberate. What followed was not a meteoric rise. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography would describe him decades later as a cautious entrepreneur who gradually built up his trade, relying on modest profits for growth and taking care not to overextend himself with creditors. This is the voice of a man who knew what he had and what he could afford to lose. The candy trade in mid-Victorian Canada was not a romantic business. It was the methodical conversion of sugar and flavoring and labor into something children would beg their parents to buy, and shopkeepers would order by the barrel, and small Ontario towns would consume in steadily growing quantities as the railway pushed west and the country thickened with people. He grew the firm one careful year at a time. In 1872, he built larger premises and briefly took on a silent partner, a man named A. Keenlyside, to finance the expansion. The arrangement didn't last. McCormick preferred to grow on his own retained profits. In July of 1879, he incorporated the business as the McCormick Manufacturing Company Limited. He and Catherine moved into a substantial brick house where she raised their children, eventually 7 sons and 5 daughters. The year 1879 mattered for another reason, one that would shape every decision McCormick made for the rest of his life. In Ottawa, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald was passing the national policy, a deliberate raising of tariffs against imported manufactured goods, intended to shelter Canadian industry from the much larger and more efficient producers across the border in the United States. The average weighted tariff rose from about 14% to roughly 21%. It would stay there, more or less, for the next century. For a London candy maker competing against American confectioners with bigger plants and cheaper sugar, the tariff wall was the difference between survival and extinction. McCormick incorporated his company inside that wall. Everything that followed, the expansion, the innovation, the dynasty, would be built inside it. Chapter 2. the king of candy. He was a Methodist, a conservative, a member of London City Council in the 1870s, and a founding member of the city's Board of Trade in 1881. He held office hours in church basements and the council chamber and the boardroom. He was, by every documented account, the kind of Victorian businessman the era produced in bulk: devout, civic-minded, conservative in both politics and money. Locals called him the king of candy. What he understood, earlier than most of his competitors, was that the future of the food business lay not just in what you made, but in how you sold it. In 1880, McCormick became one of the first Canadian food manufacturers to adopt unit retail packaging. He began distributing his soda biscuits in 3-pound paperboard boxes, a small detail, easily overlooked, that helped end the era of the Cracker Barrel and the bulk scoop. A box of biscuits at a known price, sealed against dust and damp in the grocer's not quite clean hands, was the kind of innovation that turned a commodity into a brand. In the 1890s, he went further. He adopted trade names, Jersey cream sodas, and a trademark image: a boy in colonial dress with a velvet jacket and a lace collar, modeled on the popular novel Little Lord Fauntleroy. 20 years later, Canadian Grocer magazine would still be running advertisements in which that boy represented, in the company's own phrase, the highest achievement in the art of biscuit making. McCormick had grasped something that wouldn't become received wisdom in Canadian manufacturing for another half-century: that a name, repeated and protected and attached to a consistent product, was an asset more durable than any factory. The factory itself, by the turn of the century, had moved. The original Clarence Street premises had been outgrown long before. The new plant stood on the southeast corner of Dundas and Wellington, the spot that would, years later, become the site of the Hotel London. It was a substantial multi-story brick building, the kind a Canadian city of 50,000 could be proud of. By 1900, McCormick's was manufacturing for national distribution. Boxes of Jersey cream sodas were riding the railway to Halifax and Winnipeg. He had built the business his way. He had survived the long depression of the 1870s, the various banking crises of the 1880s and 90s, the competition from Perrin and from larger Eastern firms like Christie Brown of Toronto. He was now nearing 70. His sons were stepping forward. George Gleason McCormick, the eldest, had been vice president since the early 1890s. Frank A. McCormick was learning the trade. And there was a younger son, Thomas Jr., with an unusually careful eye for how things were built. In the spring of 1906, the elder McCormick traveled to California, in the words of the obituary, in the vain hope of improving his declining health. He didn't make it home. He died on the 6th of June, 1906, in Newton, Kansas, on the return journey. His body was brought back to London for burial. He had been 75 years old, and the candy company he had founded 48 years earlier on a Clarence Street rental was now one of the largest confectionery operations in Canada. His funeral was the kind of civic event a city the size of London staged only rarely. The mayor attended. The Board of Trade closed for the afternoon. The papers ran obituaries that emphasized his caution, his shrewdness, his quiet philanthropy, the home he had endowed for aged people at Victoria Hospital, the funding he had provided for a tuberculosis facility at the Muskoka Cottage Hospital. He had given money the way he had run his business, privately, methodically, without making a show of it. The sons inherited a company and a question. The Dundas and Wellington plant was already crowded. Demand for the products kept rising, and public concern about food purity, driven by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in the same year as Thomas's death, and by a wave of pure food legislation in both Canada and the United States, was raising expectations about what a modern food factory should look like. Bulk barrels and dusty floors and unwashed hands were on their way out. The Cracker Barrel era that the elder McCormick had helped to end was finally, definitively, over. George Gleason became president. Frank A. stepped forward as a senior officer. But it was the third son who would make the decision that would define the company for the next century, and would leave, on the eastern edge of London, a building that would still be standing more than 100 years later, even when nearly everything else about the company was gone. Thomas Jr., the son with the careful eye, got on a steamship and went looking for ideas. Chapter 3. A Palace on Priest's Swamp. He toured over 100 biscuit and candy factories. He went through the great industrial centers of Europe, German confectioneries running on imported sugar, English biscuit factories that had perfected mass production a generation earlier, the great chocolate works at Bournville. He went to the United States and walked through the operations of his American competitors, the firms that the national policy tariff was holding at bay, but whose techniques were not embargoed. He took notes. He measured. He came home with a vision. What he had seen, in the most advanced plants, was a new kind of factory. Not the dim, multi-story brick boxes of the Victorian era. Buildings where light reached only the windows and the interior worked by gas lamp. The new factories were monuments to glass and concrete. They flooded every working surface with daylight. Their walls were tiled. Their floors were sealed. They could be hosed down at the end of every shift. They didn't smell. They didn't crawl. They produced food that a modern customer could trust. He wanted to build one in London. The city was prepared to help. In the years before the First World War, London's council was actively courting industry to its eastern edge, a stretch of newly serviced land that had been, in living memory, drained marshland, known locally as Priest's Swamp. The council offered fixed-rate taxes and temporary exemptions to firms willing to build. McCormick's accepted the terms. The site they chose was at 1156 Dundas Street, on more than 100 acres of former farmland east of the city core, with railway access and room to grow. The architects were Watt and Blackwell, a London firm. The contractors were Frost and Winchester of Windsor, just across the river from Detroit. And the structural system was the most advanced industrial construction technique in North America. The Kahn system of reinforced concrete, developed by the Detroit architect Albert Kahn and his brother Julius, whose Trust Concrete Steel Company was based in Walkerville, Ontario, on the Canadian side of the Detroit River. The Kahns were industrial architecture's first family. Albert was already designing the auto plants that would build modern Detroit. McCormick's building would be one of his system's earliest applications in the Canadian food industry. Construction began in 1912. By late 1913, one local history places the completion date at the 17th of December. The building was finished. It opened in 1914. The specifications, drawn from the company's own commemorative pamphlet, read like a recipe for a small cathedral. 1.5 million bricks, 800 tons of steel, 100,000 bags of cement, 450 tons of white-glazed terracotta and tile, 45,000 square feet of glass, 150,000 feet of maple flooring, nearly 10 acres of floor space across multiple stories. Total cost, about $1,019,14. Roughly $20 million in today's money. But the figure that mattered, the one that gave the building its name, was that windows accounted for 68% of the exterior walls. 68%. Light came in from every direction. On a clear London morning, the interior glowed. On a snowy afternoon, the white terracotta facade seemed to absorb the storm and turn it warm. Locals called it the Sunshine Palace. Some called it the Palace of Sweets. The company's own pamphlet would later use both names interchangeably. It opened with about 420 employees and a public boast, one of the largest, modern, most sanitary, and most efficient factories of its kind in North America. The boast was true. What made the Sunshine Palace remarkable wasn't only the glass and the terracotta. It was what Thomas Jr. had built for the workers inside. The plant had large dining rooms. It had a gymnasium. It had a library. It had locker rooms and medical facilities, and restrooms that were genuinely restful. Places where a woman finishing a long shift on the wrapping machines could sit down without anyone watching her. Outside, on the grounds, there were tennis courts, a baseball diamond, bowling greens, croquet lawns. In an era of sweatshops, when garment factories in Toronto and Montreal were still notorious for the conditions in which they ran their female workforces, and when the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York was only 3 years in the past, McCormick's amenities were not normal. They were, in the careful phrasing of the London Public Library's historical records, unusual. Thomas Jr. had designed the factory with women in mind. The candy and biscuit trade ran on female labor, on the dexterity required to pack a chocolate without crushing it, to wrap a sweet without tearing the foil. He understood that the employer who offered the best workplace would attract the best workers. Competition for women's labor in pre-war Ontario was real, and Thomas Jr. intended to win it. The British and the Americans both, in their own factory cultures, had built workplaces that prioritized throughput over the workers' comfort. McCormick's, in 1914, was something else. It was a Canadian building. It used American structural technology and borrowed from European industrial design. But the philosophy, the bowling green, the library, the medical room, was the founder's son working out what a humane modern factory might look like in a country that was still, in 1914, figuring out what it wanted to be. Chapter 4. The Palace at Work. A worker arriving for the morning shift at McCormick's in the years around the First World War walked up Dundas Street through air that was already sweet half a block before she reached the gates. Sugar, baking, peppermint. The building announced itself before you saw it. And when you saw it, the brick and the terra-cotta and the long banks of windows could stop you on the sidewalk, even if you walked past it every morning of your working life. Inside, the palace was sorted into floors and departments the way a small city is sorted into neighborhoods. There was a biscuit floor. The smell of soda crackers baking is unmistakable to anyone who has ever stood near a working oven, a kind of warm, yeasted weight in the air. There was a candy department, where the hard candies were poured, drawn, cut, and cooled on long marble slabs. There was a wrapping floor, where machines moved fast enough to blur the eye, and there was the chocolate dipping section, which was the heart of the operation in a way nothing else quite was. A photograph survives from 1915, taken by the London photographer Henry G. Hines. It shows a row of young women at a long counter, each one dipping a confection into a vat of chocolate, lifting it out with a small tool, setting it on a tray. A London Free Press caption from many years later, written by the columnist James Reaney, would describe the scene with precision. The girls and young women who did this work could average, between them, 45 kilograms of chocolate a day. That figure, 100 pounds of dipped chocolate by the end of an 8-hour shift, was their hands moving from morning bell to lunch whistle to afternoon bell, every motion practiced until it was unconscious. Later, a machine called a chocolate enrober would replace much of that hand dipping. The enrober could move 900 kilograms of chocolate an hour. It would do, in 60 minutes, what it had taken the entire chocolate dipping department a full day to do by hand. But that was later. In 1915, it was women, at the counter. And the work was still skilled work, the kind of skill that took months to acquire and could be ruined by a tired wrist or an unsteady morning. The maple flooring, all 150,000 feet of it, was sealed against sugar dust. The lighting from the great windows, that 68% of glass, meant a worker rarely needed to squint to read a label or check a color. The ventilation had been designed into the building from the start, the rising heat of the ovens drawn up and out, the cool morning air pulled in low along the walls. Thomas Jr. had thought about how the building would breathe. The workforce was overwhelmingly female on the factory floor, with men handling the heavy work, the loading docks, the steam plant, the maintenance shops, the warehouses where the finished product waited for the railway. Many of the women were young, single, working their first paid job. Many of the men had come up through the trades. The ratio shifted over the decades, but the pattern held. Candy and biscuit work in Canada was women's work, supervised by men, supported by men's heavier labor around the edges. The same was true at Christie Brown in Toronto, at Nielsen, at every major confectionery in the country. What distinguished McCormick's was the conditions in which that work was done. The products kept multiplying. The hard candies, the founding business, became dozens of distinct lines. Marshmallow confections came in, and the brand built its long-term identity around them. Strawberry marshmallow, marshmallow bananas. Decades later, anyone who had grown up in Ontario could close their eyes and call up the texture of a marshmallow banana. The slight crust of sugar on the outside, the soft give beneath, the artificial banana flavor that had nothing to do with any real fruit but tasted exactly like childhood. licorice babies, spearmint leaves, blue whales, cherry twist, jube jubes, and the biscuits, Jersey cream sodas above all, the brand the elder Thomas had built, kept shipping by the boxcar to every corner of the country. Through the First World War, the factory ran at full capacity. Canada was sending men to France and Flanders. The country was also sending boxes, candies and biscuits packed in standardized tins, designed for shipment overseas, designed to survive a winter on the deck of a freighter and the inside of a quartermaster's warehouse. The exact volume of McCormick's military contribution in those years isn't fully documented in the surviving records, but the general pattern of the Canadian confectionery industry is clear. Every major plant supplied something. Soldiers in the trenches got biscuits with their tea. Hospitals got candies for the wounded. The home front got the same products the country had been buying before the war, packaged now in tins that bore the patriotic colors of the country, whose flag was still the red ensign. The elder McCormick brother, George Gleason, was president through the war years. Frank A. McCormick, the founder's son, became president in 1920 and would hold that role for 45 years until his death in June 1965. 45 years is the kind of tenure that makes a man into the company in ways that go beyond the title. Frank A. ran the palace through the Roaring '20s, through the Depression, through the Second World War, through the post-war boom. When he died, the company was, in every meaningful sense, his. The 1920s were good. Sales rose. The plant expanded its product line. New machines came in. In 1926, McCormick Manufacturing absorbed several regional confectioners and bought out its longtime London competitor, the Perrin Company, becoming for a brief period the Canada Biscuit Company. The two old rivals, the Irish candy man from Clarence Street and the biscuit maker from across town, had finally settled their 70-year contest. McCormick's had won. Then, 1929 happened. The crash arrived in Canada with the same speed and the same consequences it carried everywhere else. Demand for premium biscuits and luxury candy collapsed. The Sunshine Palace did not stop running. Confectionery, even in a depression, has a remarkable resilience because it is one of the cheapest possible pleasures, and people will buy a 5-cent candy when they cannot afford anything else. But the margins disappeared. The company that Thomas McCormick had built on caution and retained profits now found itself, for the first time in its history, in serious financial trouble. By the mid-1930s, the family could no longer carry it alone. And in 1937, the McCormicks did what the founder, with his deep dislike of debt and outside capital, had spent his entire life avoiding. They sold. The buyer was George Weston Limited, the Toronto bakery dynasty that had been built by the elder Weston a generation earlier and was now being run, with great ambition, by W. Garfield Weston. Weston was a low-cost producer in a deflationary economy, and he was making a habit of buying distressed food assets at distressed prices. McCormick's, with its $500,000 factory and its national distribution, was exactly the kind of acquisition that interested him. The brand survived. The name above the gates didn't change. F.A. McCormick stayed on as a director, and Frank A. remained president. Would remain president, in fact, for nearly 30 more years. From the outside, very little appeared to have shifted. But the company that the cautious Irishman had built had crossed a line he would never have crossed. It was no longer his family's. And the decisions that mattered most were no longer being made in London. Chapter 5. The Smokestack Bookend. From the outside, the next 3 decades looked like a continuation of everything that had come before, only bigger. Weston was, in his way, a careful steward. He invested. He let the McCormick brothers and their successors run the plant. He didn't strip it for parts. And under Weston ownership, the Sunshine Palace did something it had never done as an independent company. It grew. The Second World War brought the factory back to wartime production. Biscuits and candies again, packed in tins again, sent overseas again. The post-war boom brought a flood of demand. By 1952, the plant employed 1,194 people. In 1958, Weston financed a major addition to the building, a substantial expansion to the east, designed to accommodate new product lines and new machinery, the chocolate enrober among them. By the mid-1960s, McCormick's was one of the two anchors of London's industrial East End. The other was the Kellogg's cereal plant, a few blocks west on Dundas, which had been operating in the city since the early 1920s. Together, McCormick's and Kellogg's were the bookends of what locals called the smokestack district, the two great food factories that defined what East London made and who East London was. In 1967, Canada's centennial year, the year of Expo in Montreal, the year the country celebrated 100 years since Confederation with an exuberance it would not feel again, the McCormick's plant reached its peak employment. Approximately 1,300 people worked there. Many of them had been there for 25 years. The general manager that year was a man named James Middleton. The factory was producing, at full capacity, 135,000 pounds of candy and 100,000 pounds of biscuits per day. 1,300 workers. 135,000 pounds of candy. Every working day. It was the highest point. Frank A. McCormick had died 2 years earlier, on the 8th of June, 1965, at the age of 86, having spent his entire adult life inside the company his father had founded. His grave, at Mount Pleasant Cemetery in London, was a short drive from the factory gates. He had not lived to see the peak, but he had built the trajectory that led to it. Nobody on the factory floor that centennial year, not Middleton in his office, not the women on the chocolate dipping line, not the men loading boxcars at the rear dock, could see what was coming. The Sunshine Palace was full of light. The orders were stacked. The workforce was deep in the kind of multi-generational stability that defined Canadian manufacturing at its mid-century best. But somewhere far from London, in boardrooms in Toronto, in trade conferences in Washington, in the offices of economists who were starting to argue that Canada's tariff wall had outlived its usefulness, the conditions that had built the palace were already starting to come apart. The wall would come down, and when it did, the palace would have nothing left to lean against. Chapter 6. The Wall Comes Down. The first cracks were not American. They were generational. By the early 1970s, the founding generation of McCormick's leadership was gone. Frank A. had died in 1965. The James Middleton era at general manager gave way to a succession of professional managers. Competent men, by all accounts, but men who had not grown up inside a family business. The plant kept running. The candy kept shipping. But the Weston organization in Toronto, which now owned everything, had its own priorities. And the McCormick's plant in London was one division among many. The 1970s and 80s did to Canadian manufacturing what those decades did to manufacturing across the Atlantic world. The oil shocks raised costs. Inflation ate margins. New machinery from Germany and Italy and Japan did things Canadian machinery couldn't, at prices Canadian buyers couldn't match. The chocolate enrober that had once been a marvel was now 20 years old. The wrapping lines that had set the standard in the 1950s were now slower than what a new American plant could install in 6 months. And the political conversation in Ottawa was shifting. The tariff wall, the national policy that MacDonald had built in 1879, the wall that had stood for more than a century, the wall inside which the elder Thomas McCormick had incorporated his company, was, by the early 1980s, being argued about openly for the first time in generations. Economists at universities and in Ottawa, think tanks were producing papers that questioned whether protection still served Canada's interests. Business leaders, particularly in resource industries, wanted access to American markets. The Mulroney government, elected in 1984, took up the question as a defining national project. The 1988 federal election was fought on free trade. Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives ran on the agreement. John Turner's Liberals ran against it. The campaign was bitter. Manufacturing communities across Ontario watched it with the particular attention of people who understood, intuitively, that their working lives were the variable in the equation. Mulroney won. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement was signed. It came into effect on the 1st of January, 1989. The agreement didn't close any factories that day. What it did was begin to remove the wall, slowly, in scheduled stages, over a decade. George Weston Limited, in Toronto, was paying attention. Galen Weston, who had taken over the family company, was running a sophisticated portfolio that included Loblaws supermarkets, the Weston bakeries, and a thicket of food manufacturing operations of which McCormick's was one. The 1990s recession was coming. The expected passage of what would become NAFTA in 1994 would extend free trade to Mexico, which meant Mexican wages would be in the calculation alongside American ones. And Weston's Canadian biscuit operations, McCormick's prominent among them, were, in this new continental landscape, the wrong size. Too big to be a craft producer, too small to compete with R.J.R. Nabisco and Pillsbury at scale. In 1988, the same year Mulroney won the free trade election, Weston began the strategic overhaul of its food processing division. By 1990, the Canadian biscuit operations had been sold for $120 million. McCormick's, the Sunshine Palace on Dundas Street, the Jersey cream sodas, the marshmallow bananas, the chocolate dipping line that traced back to 1915, was now the property of a Montreal company called Culinar. The factory looked the same. The workers walked through the same gates. The candy still smelled the way candy had always smelled half a block downwind. But the decisions about McCormick's future were now being made in Montreal by people who had their own priorities, their own Quebec heritage brands to defend, and no particular feeling for an English-speaking London plant inherited as part of a bundle of assets. For the first time in 76 years, the palace was nobody's flagship. Chapter 7. The Montreal Years. Culinar was, in its own context, a serious company. Headquartered in Montreal, it had been built around Vachon, the Quebec snack cake institution, whose Jos Louis and May West cakes were as embedded in Quebec childhoods as marshmallow bananas were in Ontario ones. Culinar's heart was in those Quebec brands. McCormick's was a peripheral asset, acquired in a portfolio purchase, run from a distance. The 1990s recession hit hard. NAFTA came into force on the 1st of January, 1994. And from that point forward, McCormick's chocolate-dipped confections and Jersey cream sodas were competing for shelf space in Canadian supermarkets against products that could be manufactured in Mexico, shipped duty-free, and sold at margins a London plant with 1958-era machinery could not match. The competitive landscape that had taken 70 years to evolve had been redrawn in 6. Culinar's solution, like the solution arrived at by food conglomerates across the continent, was rationalization. Plants were assessed. Underperforming product lines were cut. The London workforce, which had peaked at 1,300 in 1967 and stood at roughly 1,000 in the early 1980s, declined steadily through the Culinar years. By the mid-1990s, it was well below that. A worker who had started at McCormick's in 1965, the year Frank A. died, the year the company was still unambiguously the McCormick family's legacy, even if Weston owned the shares, was, by 1995, working in a plant whose ownership had changed twice and whose product line was being managed by executives in Montreal who had never set foot on the Dundas Street floor. The chocolate enrober was 35 years old. The wrapping machines were older. The cafeteria still ran. The bowling green was long gone. The factory whistle was still the factory whistle. But the building had begun to feel its age. In 1997, Culinar sold McCormick's again. The buyer this time was Beta Brands, Incorporated, based in Chicago. The exact terms of the sale were not made public in detail. What was made public? By what Beta said in industry press, by what the Culinar leadership told reporters, by what the McCormick's workers were told at the meetings in the cafeteria, was that the new American owners had ambitious plans. There would be investment. There would be modernization. There would be consolidation into London, not out. Operations from a Hamilton facility and a Toronto facility would be brought to the Dundas Street plant. London would be the center of Beta's Canadian confectionery operation. Some of this was true. Some Hamilton and Toronto operations did, in fact, come to London. The plant briefly seemed to be growing, but the overall employment figures kept falling. By the late 1990s, the workforce was approximately 500, well under half what it had been at the centennial year peak. Demand for the traditional product lines was eroding. The supermarket chains that bought 90% of what McCormick's made were consolidating their own buying. Fewer chains, larger volumes demanded, lower prices required. A regional confectioner, owned by a mid-sized American firm, manufacturing on antique machinery in a building that was now 80 years old, had a structural problem that no amount of consolidation could solve. And Beta Brands had its own problems. By the early 2000s, the company was in financial distress. The Dundas Street plant, the Sunshine Palace, with its terra-cotta and its 45,000 square feet of glass, was now an asset on a balance sheet in Chicago, being weighed against the cost of running it. The men in Chicago ran the numbers. The numbers did not favor London. Chapter 8. The Slow Bleed. There is a particular pattern to how a factory dies under absentee ownership, and it follows the same sequence almost every time. McCormick's in the early 2000s followed it exactly. The first stage is that capital investment stops. The new wrapping line that was promised in the consolidation announcement doesn't arrive. The chocolate enrober that needs replacing is patched and patched again, and then patched once more by a maintenance crew that knows what they're doing but is working on machinery older than they are. The line speeds drop. The yield drops with them. The cost per kilogram of finished candy rises. The men in Chicago run the numbers again. The second stage is that machines start to break and stay broken. A wrapping line that has been the workhorse of the candy floor for 40 years finally seizes, and the part needed to fix it has not been manufactured since 1978. The maintenance shop fabricates a replacement. It almost works. The line runs at 60% capacity. Then it runs at 40. Then it stops. The product line that depended on it is quietly discontinued. The third stage is that trucks start arriving at the back dock. Trucks that aren't picking up finished product, but loading equipment. Pieces of the chocolate floor leave for somewhere else. A wrapping machine is crated up and sent to a plant the parent company owns in another state. Workers watch it happen. Nobody tells them what it means. They have their own theories. By 2003, McCormick's was reportedly carrying significant debt. Specific figures circulate in informal accounts. Some mention $50 million. The precise number was not made public in any documented source available outside court records. What was visible to anyone walking past the Sunshine Palace in those years was that the parking lot was emptier than it used to be. The loading dock was quieter, and the building's white terracotta facade had started to take on the gray patina that all white buildings take on when the cleaning budget gets cut. The fourth stage is that layoffs become a regular feature of working life. Not the dramatic mass layoff that makes the evening news. Those happen at the end. The earlier layoffs are smaller and steadier. 20 workers in March, 15 in June. Another shift eliminated in the autumn. The workforce that had been 500 in 1998 was, by 2005, well below 300. A woman who had worked the candy line for 30 years would arrive one morning to find that the person she'd worked beside for 15 of those years was gone. There would be no ceremony. There would be no announcement. There would just be one fewer face in the cafeteria. The fifth stage is that management becomes unreachable. The local managers, the men whose offices were in the building, the men who would once have known every worker on the floor by name, they began to lose their authority. The decisions came from Chicago. The Chicago decision-makers did not visit. Phone calls were not returned. The union, the workers were represented in the later years by the United Food and Commercial Workers, found itself bargaining with people who would not commit to anything because the people they were bargaining with did not themselves know what was going to happen. Through 2005 and 2006, the rhythm of the plant got stranger. Raw materials orders that should have arrived didn't. Production schedules were drawn up and then canceled. Whole product lines were quietly discontinued without explanation. The chocolate dipping line that traced its lineage back to Henry G. Heinz's 1915 photograph was running at a fraction of its former volume. By the autumn of 2006, the workers knew. They didn't know exactly, but they knew. Chapter 9. The Last Christmas. The plant traditionally closed for 2 weeks at Christmas. It was a long-standing custom. The maintenance crew did their major work during those weeks: the deep cleaning, the equipment overhauls, the inspections. The candy floor went quiet. The workers went home. They returned on the second Monday of January, refreshed, to start the year's production run. In December of 2006, the workers, about 275 of them remained on the payroll, went home for that customary Christmas break. They were told the plant would reopen in late January, not the usual second Monday of January. Late January. They didn't think much of it at the time. They had Christmas to think about. On the 3rd of January, 2007, McCormick's was placed in receivership. The announcement came not from the local managers, but from the courts. The plant would not be reopening. The workers, 275 of them, many of whom had been there 15, 20, 30 years, were not to return. Many were owed back wages. Some had been working without pay for weeks before the Christmas break. The receivership process was the legal machinery by which they would attempt to recover what they were owed. It was slow. It was procedural. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a substitute for the wages that should have been paid in November and December. The plant was empty. The Sunshine Palace, which had opened in 1914 with 420 employees, which had peaked in 1967 with 1,300, which had survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression and the recessions of the 1970s and 80s, had ceased operations. The brand survived. Within the year, the McCormick's candy line, the marshmallow bananas, the spearmint leaves, the licorice babies, the blue whales, the cherry twists, the jube jubes, was acquired by Regal Confections of Laval, Quebec. The candy continued to be manufactured, not in London, not in the palace, but the candy continued. Through 2007 and into 2008, the corporate wind-down proceeded. Equipment was auctioned. Inventory was sold. The City of London found itself owed roughly $750,000 in unpaid property taxes. The owner could not, or would not, pay them. In time, the city vested the land, took possession of the property in lieu of the back taxes. The Sunshine Palace was now publicly owned, by default. It sat empty. 7 years later, in December of 2014, the Kellogg's cereal plant a few blocks west on Dundas Street, the other bookend of London's smokestack district, announced its final closure. 500 more jobs lost. The union president there, a man named Bob Martin, called it the end of an era for London. He used the same phrase that had been used about McCormick's 7 years earlier. The same phrase that was being used across Ontario, about Heinz in Leamington, and Caterpillar in London, and Ford in St. Thomas, and Smuckers, and Navistar. Since 2002, Ontario's manufacturing sector had shrunk by nearly 30%, more than 300,000 jobs. McCormick's was not unique. McCormick's was the pattern. A woman who had spent her working life on the candy floor. A woman who had started at 18 in 1972, who had married another McCormick's worker, who had raised 3 children on the paychecks, who had watched the workforce shrink from 1,000 to 500 to 275, and finally to 0, was sitting at home that January in a London winter, waiting for a phone call from a receiver about back wages. The palace stood empty across town. The candy was still on the shelves at the corner store. Chapter 10. What remains? The first stage of an abandoned building's life is that the scrappers come. They came to McCormick's quickly. Copper wiring, brass fittings, steel that could be cut out and carried away. Within a few years of the 2007 closure, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of metals had been stripped from the palace. The men who did this work were not, by and large, organized criminals. They were men who needed money, working in a city where the factories that had provided that money were closing one after another, taking from a building that nobody seemed to be protecting. The second stage is that the photographers come. Urban explorers, a loose international community of people who document abandoned industrial buildings, discovered McCormick's. By the early 2000s, the Sunshine Palace was one of the most photographed derelict buildings in Canada. The London photographer who went by the handle Germ the Ninth documented the interior in 2012 and 2013. Alex Loix had been inside in 2010 and 2011. Michael Lalande's Talking Walls. photography series produced an extensive record. A photographer who worked under the name Freaktography came too. Hundreds of photographs began to circulate. The building acquired its own Instagram location tag, a service that had not existed when the plant closed, applied retroactively by visitors who came years later to photograph what remained. What they found in the white terracotta palace of light that Thomas Jr. had built in 1914 was a kind of beauty that nobody had designed. Snow drifting through windows that had once been the building's pride. Maple flooring buckled by years of freeze-thaw cycles. The chocolate-dipping hall where the women in Henry Hines's 1915 photograph had once worked, now empty, now silent. The long counter still there. The light still coming in through the surviving windows in the same way it had in 1915. The interior had become, without intending to, a memorial. In September of 2012, an arsonist set fire to the rear warehouse. The damage was assessed at $100,000. The London Fire Department, in subsequent statements about the building's condition, described it as exactly the kind of structure where a horror film might be shot. A subsequent demolition removed much of the rear of the complex. On the 11th of November, 2014, the City of London designated the front section of the property. The original 1913 Sunshine Palace, the section facing Dundas Street with the white terracotta facade, and the M and C pendants on the entrance canopy, under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. The massing of the original building was now legally protected. The additions of 1958 and after were not. 2 years later, in March of 2016, the property was sold for $1 to a development corporation called McCormick's Villages, an arm of Sierra Construction of Woodstock. The City of London approved the McCormick's Villages mixed-use redevelopment in October of 2022. Townhouses, a long-term care facility, a seniors apartment building, a public park, and the rehabilitated Heritage Building. Disputes followed about heights and public access. An Ontario Land Tribunal hearing was scheduled for June of 2024. In April of 2025, on a section of the property at the rear of the original site, ground was broken for a 192-bed long-term care home, a $77 million facility operated by Extendicare. Mayor Josh Morgan attended the groundbreaking. The home, he announced, would begin accepting residents in the summer of 2027. The construction itself was being handled by D. Grant Construction. The building would be 3 stories. It would have 119,652 square feet of floor space. The heritage-designated 1913 front building, the Sunshine Palace itself, still stood, derelict, across the property from the new construction. A man named Sean Watson, a Londoner with a metal detector, has been working the soil where the McCormick's cafeteria once stood. He has been finding cafeteria tokens, small metal discs the workers used to buy lunch in the company canteen, a 1-cent token, a 3-cent token, pieces of the small change of a vanished working community, surfacing from the ground a generation after the community itself dispersed. A box of McCormick's marshmallow bananas, manufactured now in Quebec by Regal Confections, manufactured to the same recipe that was being followed inside the Sunshine Palace in 1958 and 1972 and 1995, sits on the shelf at a corner store in East London. A child buys one. She doesn't know the building down the street. She doesn't know what was built and what was lost. The candy tastes the way the candy has always tasted. That is what survives. Not the factory, not the 1,300 jobs, not the bowling green or the company library, or the medical room that Thomas Jr. built for his workers in 1914. Not the chocolate-dipping line where the women in the 1915 photograph averaged 45 kilograms of dipped chocolate between them every day. Not the wrapping machines, or the maple flooring, or the 45,000 square feet of glass that earned the building its name. A candy in a wrapper. A heritage designation on a derelict facade. A long-term care home on the ground where the loading dock used to stand. A handful of cafeteria tokens in the soil. And the photographs, thousands of them now, of a white terracotta palace that an Irish grocer's son built in 1914, and that nobody in particular killed. Not through one failure, not through the depression that took its independence, not through the foreign owners who shipped its equipment to other plants, not through the trade agreements that opened the border, through the long, slow accumulation of decisions made by people who were paid to make them, and a wall that had stood for 100 years coming down a foot at a time until there was nothing left for the palace to lean against. The snow drifts in through the broken windows. The light still falls the way Thomas Jr. designed it to fall. The terracotta is still white in places. And somewhere across the city, in a corner store on a winter afternoon, a child opens a wrapper, and a small piece of what was built in 1858 and what was lost in 2007 is on her tongue and gone.